and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It is Friday, and it is time for our weekend review. The goal here is that we go out and track, research, analyze vulnerabilities, exploits, and different TTPs from different areas of our space, just so that you don't have to, ultimately with the goal of making you a little bit more prepared today than you were yesterday. So today you've got myself, Brad, and Mr. Spencer as well to talk about three kind of cool stories that we came across this week.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to it. So we've got a couple of awesome articles and stories to talk about today. We're going to be talking about macros. Once again, Microsoft Office macros. We'll talk about BlackCat, ransomware, and kind of how it's not merely bad luck that BlackCat is attacking organizations. And we'll talk about AIG. It's a threat group that CyberInt, I believe the organization's name. Yeah, CyberInt. Yeah, researchers from CyberInt discovered recently, and that's going to be an interesting one. AIG stands for Atlas Intelligence Group. It's a new threat group that's emerged. So good stuff in this episode. Looking forward to another week of some good conversation and discussion.
Sweet.
So awesome. So the first kind of topic on the agenda is macros. We talked about this, I think, last week and the week before that.
This is our third week talking about macros, man.
And for those following along, or maybe not, Microsoft has gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on this macros thing. And kind of the TLDR here is on July 21st, which was yesterday, if you're watching this on or listening to this on Friday this week, Microsoft announced that they'd be rolling out auto blocking of VBA macros in Office documents. Now, what they're doing is something that anyone, an IT administrator, can do themselves if they wanted to already. You could go out and do this proactively, but Microsoft is rolling out a change in the default behavior. And that default behavior is to block malicious Office documents that have malicious VBA macros in them by default. So Microsoft is going to block these by default if they come from untrusted locations like the internet, from email, things like that. So why this is important, and then we'll kind of talk about some of the sidebars, is this is a big win for security. And this is something we talk about a lot. It's a big initial access vector for ransomware. VBA macros, killing this vector off or blocking these malicious Office macros is a big win for kind of killing off this attack vector. And it's been abused for many, many years. And it's cool to see Microsoft kind of taking ownership of their products, right? And rolling some of these security defaults in and not upselling them or charging extra for them, but kind of baking the security in.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Interesting that we've gone back and forth, and after doing a little bit of research, I kind of understand why that we took this roundabout way to get here. But I agree with you. I think that for whatever inconveniences this might create, the risk of having macros enabled by default is just too high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're one of the organizations that has departments that still use macros in documents, right, then there are better ways to allow those things. So you can allow them through trusted locations, it's called. There's various other ways to allow those macros to run. But I think all in all, it's good to just flat out block them and kind of allow them as they're needed to reduce that attack surface, right? And as a sidebar to this, something I wanted to bring up was, we're noticing a trend with Microsoft, and like I said, baking in these secure defaults, which is good, right? Some examples of this in other areas, not just in Office macros, but secure defaults in Azure AD, right?
Yep.
There's something called secure defaults, and that enables a whole bunch of security settings, most notably multi-factor, right? When you enable those security defaults in Azure AD, that enables MFA across the board, which is great, because a lot of times we'll respond to an incident or we'll go pen test an organization, and we'll password trade, we'll get a password, we log in, right? No MFA.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's very common to see. The other thing that was something that was just announced was Windows 11. The latest build of Windows 11 now has default account lockout policies, or a policy to help mitigate RDP and brute force password attacks vectors. And that's, again, combating ransomware, right? Human operated ransomware, it's very common for them to get in via brute forcing RDP through malicious Office documents, etc. So it's really cool to see kind of Microsoft stepping up to the game a bit on just secure defaults.
I agree 100%, man. And these are, we talk about blocking and tackling all the time, right? And all Microsoft's really doing is pushing people to do the basics. Yeah. The minimum standard are the things that you just described. And if you're not even doing those, maybe you get BlackCat, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the cool things, the last thing I'll say about this is it's being backported. So that feature I said with account lockout policy, supposedly it's being backported to Windows 10. So we'll have to see, what comes of that. But Microsoft has a couple articles here I'm sharing, and they have some links for not only users, but administrators, right, on how to administer Office macros and how to allow them. So some good documentation for them, for users and administrators.
Yeah, and I think, just to kind of wrap that up too, part of the reason Microsoft got a little bit of kickback, from what I understand in reading a few articles, is that they didn't really give a fair warning to anybody. They just flipped the switch on macro blocking, and there were a substantial number of people who used macros from untrusted sources every single day, and it basically nuked their business because they couldn't figure out how to turn it back on. And so they were like, okay, fine, we'll do it right. And, just like a lot of the things that Microsoft does, right? Well-intentioned, awful execution, and so I think this was another illustration of said process.
Which is crazy to think, because change like that can just cripple, the workflow of an organization, right? It's the same thing with, like, when it comes to ransomware, it's denial of servicing your business. Just through, trying to do better and make things more secure. It's like, if you can cripple an organization by turning these macros off, that's a sign that there's some things that need to change, probably.
Yes. Yeah. That means your organization might need some support from an IT, DR, BCP perspective, right?
Yeah. Cool. So the next item on our list is BlackCat. Now, this was an interesting story from BlackCat. BlackCat's a relatively newcomer to the ransomware game, and this article by Sophos was really good.
Is it that specific BlackCat?
Like the picture of the black cat?
I'm assuming that's the actual cat that's involved in this, but keep going.
Yeah, it's actually a behind the scenes photo of the actual operator.
I thought it might be. I thought so. Yeah. Looks like a really smart cat. But anyway, continue.
So this article kind of reads as a what not to do, or if you want to get owned by ransomware, do these things, and sure enough, you'll probably get ransomware in your environment. So, if you got a honeypot or something, do these things, and you'll be a prime target. So this reads like a what not to do, and it's a good lesson learned kind of article. So we can kind of talk about some of the things that we probably all have in our environment that we should pay attention to, because these are the things that ransomware operators look for and go after. So BlackCat targets large organizations, and Sophos did some response on several cases since December 2021. And kind of the short story long of the pattern that they noticed was the operators exploited a vulnerability in an unpatched or an outdated firewall or VPN device. They established their foothold on that device, and then they pivoted to internal systems and kind of went about their way doing what they do once they get in. And in several cases, they obtained VPN credentials from memory of the firewall devices. So these devices were unpatched. They had old versions, right? They had vulnerabilities where you could retrieve the credentials from memory. So they took those, logged in over VPN, and And again, all these cases that Sophos talks about, there was no MFA on those VPN logins.
Mhm.
And then kind of the story of this, once an actor gets in, they'll do some lateral movement, privilege escalation if they need to get the access that they need, and then they'll deploy their ransomware. And this
looks like they were targeting ESXi.
Yeah, this variant particularly likes to target ESXi, right? So particularly devastating, right? If your ESXi gets ransomware, it's particularly difficult. And there's a lot of nuance to this article, and it's a really good read.
Mm-hmm.
The main reason, like I said, for bringing it up is to kind of illustrate what BlackCat's doing from a technique standpoint and a strategy standpoint, and then talk about what not to do and kind of how to mitigate some of these things.
Sure. Yeah, you're right. This does read a lot like a how to get ransomware 101. Yep. And, it's a checklist of stuff. And, again, we've already said blocking and tackling once. I think we're going to have to start doing like, paying money every time we use that phrase or something, just to cut it down. But yeah, man. So look, this article is written, this week, right? Yeah, this week.
Yep.
And we're talking about a current threat actor attacking systems that are unpatched for 4 years.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is just borderline neglectful. And if you're asking yourself, man, I wonder if my firewall's vulnerable, right? Then maybe your asset management and your patch management processes need some work. The point is, right, we shouldn't have a security appliance, a VPN/firewall, whatever, sitting out on the public internet that hasn't been patched in 4 years. And then to top it off, like you said, not only are they not patched, but they're misconfigured. I'm calling it misconfiguration because they don't have MFA. So it's just tough, man. Like mistake after mistake after mistake,
Yep. Yeah. And a lot of these, we go into organizations, we pen test a lot of organizations, we do assessments, and a lot of these things ring true, right? That you mentioned. And some of the other things that this article references is not only legacy software of firewall and VPN devices, but systems running Windows 7, right? A number of systems with old operating systems, flat networks, right? No MFA, like we talked about. So you pointed to asset management, segregation, that's a lesson in at least turning on host firewalls on workstations, trying to restrict the communication, in deploying least privilege on those workstations. So a local admin on one workstation is not the same on the other, right? And try and restrict access to those workstations so it's harder for threat actors to deploy ransomware across the organization. Strong passwords, all those things, like you said, blocking and tackling kind of thing.
Yeah. And even though we live in the offensive security space, we also recognize the tremendous amount of value that comes in from, we call it ISO work, but it's really process procedure development inside your organization. If you don't know where your patch management process is or where your your various procedures and documentation are, if you don't know where those are and don't know that they're up to date, this is the kind of stuff that happens, right? It's not that anybody's out there intentionally failing at their job. It's just like, oh man, I didn't know I had that VPN. Or or we didn't patch it because it wasn't in, it wasn't in SCCM or something like that, and suddenly you get here.
Yep. And a lot of times too, some smaller organizations with smaller IT staff are already stretched thin, and they don't understand the true value of asset management and all that comes from that, right? And then we come in and we do an ISO assessment, like a security assessment, and we say, yeah, asset management is important. Here's why. We do a lot of education in those assessments too. And it's a good opportunity for the ISO team to go in and kind of talk about the gaps, why they're important, and then importantly, how to fix those, right? How to actually implement asset management or vulnerability management, whatever it might be that you're kind of weak on. So we use this as a learning opportunity and an education opportunity as well, and hopefully we help those organizations kind of get better a little bit by a little bit, day by day, and kind of move that bar forward on their security programs.
Agreed. Yep. It's good stuff. Just a reminder of all of those things in this one article. There's like 7 different things you hit and you're just like, oh, face palm, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, it's a doozy, and it's tough to read sometimes too. When it's like, oh man, like
Right.
Windows 7 has been out of support for how long, and these firmware devices. So yeah.
Yeah.
So the last story here is from CyberInt, and they did some research and some intelligence on a new group called Atlas Intelligence Group, or AIG. I think also called Atlas Cyber Army. It says in the article.
Mm-hmm.
So this one is quite interesting. This is kind of a new model that these researchers say they haven't really seen before. The leader's supposed name or handle, I guess, is Mr. Eagle, which is kind of interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
Kind of like, Mr. Eagle.
Yeah. It's a good break from the leet speak, really short like names that you can't articulate. So
Yeah.
Good job, Mr. Eagle, for at least letting us be able to pronounce your name.
Yeah. So the reason this group was interesting is the operator or the operators that are kind of running this group appear to be outsourcing the actual hacking activities. And what they're doing is they're calling on these individual red teamers, they call them, in their communications, or cyber mercenaries, if you want to have like a crazy buzzword.
Right.
Cyber mercenaries, it's going to be the thing now. But they're using these independent contractors, right, to do the actual hacking activities, and they're kind of taking a step back from that work to remain anonymous and to avoid, being identified and being, sought after, prosecuted, and all that stuff.
Yep.
Some of the services they offer are DDoS, leaked database dumps, and then also initial access. So access to organizations or access to like admin panels and things like that. Mm-hmm. And VIP services, which is like they define as sensitive information on, individuals. So it's interesting in a couple ways, is that, like I said, they're kind of outsourcing the hacking activity. They're using they offer a various number of services, which is kind of unique too. And the article goes into a lot more detail about the group and what they offer and things like that. So yeah, I thought this was an interesting one to talk about, and bring up that, this could be a trend going forward. And certainly this article doesn't talk about ransomware a whole lot, but one of the speculations is a group like this could potentially pivot to ransomware and be fairly successful at it.
Agreed. So we actually hit on this like in one of our first 2 or 3 videos or podcasts or whatever, in that we're going to see more well-organized business models, right, coming from these guys. And a lot of people don't know this, right? So when you get a phishing email, there are already 5 different hackers / bad actors involved in the process that led to that point, right? So, there are spammers, there are people who control the botnets, there are people who farm credentials, there are people who farm emails. And so in most cases, there's kind of a forum where you can buy and sell stuff, in the older days of phishing attacks. There would be the actual attacker would stand up the phishing page, but he would pay somebody else to send the emails, right? And that still happens to some degree. And even then, the attacker and the spammer, they didn't write the malware, right? And then they're going to just sell the credentials that they farm. They're not themselves going to individually go log in. So I bring that up because the idea of a bad actor business model is not new.
Yep.
What is interesting about this, though, is you're starting to see, instead of, because the old bigwigs in the criminal underworld were people who ran the forums where people would buy and sell and exchange information. And so the idea, though, that this person is going to become the Walmart of hackers and run this environment where he is buying and selling and controlling at an individual or small group level the activities of the business, that is relatively new. There are some other examples of that out there, but like you said, usually you just kind of belong to that group, but he's just outsourcing it.
Yep.
Which is kind of neat, right? So I don't expect this is going to be the last time we have conversations about the various business models that bad actors use.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to follow along.
Yeah.
But this model probably will stay. I
Yeah.
don't see any reason it wouldn't stay.
Yeah. And for those watching on YouTube, I'm scrolling through the CyberInt article, and I have to be somewhat cautious because there's some unsavory language in some of the screenshots that are
Sure. Yeah.
that have been found. But the article goes on to mention that the leader of this, Mr. Eagle, seems to be fairly, I guess, level-headed or reasonable and sophisticated, right? It would appear that they've been around for a while. They kind of know the criminal underworlds and kind of how to run these things. They know a lot about the attacks that these groups or these independent contractors are performing. So they appear to be fairly sophisticated, right? And it's one to pay attention to and keep an eye on. Now, the article also talks about victimology a little bit, and they don't, while they don't appear to have a specific industry or region that they're operating in, they're kind of opportunistic in a way. However, when they look at their e-commerce store, which is where they kind of sell access to these things,
right?
It looks like, according to the article, it looks like the database dumps are maybe government related. A lot of the database dumps seem to be government related, whereas the RDP and web shell access that they're selling appears to belong to education, finance, manufacturing industries. So something to kind of to key in on if you're in those industries, to maybe pay attention to and keep an eye on. One other interesting thing that I thought was kind of buried in this article was that this group voluntarily hunts and docks pedophiles worldwide. So they kind of do like a public service. They might be criminals, but they still don't like bad people who do bad things. Just,
I guess,
odd and ironic.
It is,
in a way.
Yeah, I've noticed the clash of morals in the cyber community world, because I think it's easy for people to emotionally disconnect from cyber crime. It's like, oh, I just stole money from a random corporation, or, this is a file that contains the identities of 1,000 random people, and they disconnect the humanity aspect of it. And I think it allows them this sort of, ability to act like, oh, I'm not really doing anything wrong. And so it's an interesting psychological dynamic that I've noticed is a lot of these folks do not see what they do as criminal.
Yeah, and the interviews, you see those interviews from time to time from the threat actors, and they get picked up. It's always interesting to read those to see how they view the world, right? To kind of empathize with them a bit in their situation, where they are, and how they perceive the world and why they've made the choices they make. It's interesting, right? It's interesting, and it's worth reading and looking into those things. From a psychology standpoint, to understand those attacks better, or those attackers better. But yeah, it's kind of interesting dichotomy, right? Like, they clearly don't like pedophiles and people who do horrible, rotten things, but they're willing to kind of hack companies and put their livelihood in jeoupody, right? So they're willing to nuke,
nuke an individual's identity, but certain things are okay and certain things aren't. And I guess they arbitrarily decide that, which is kind of, I think, what I like to think separates the good guys from the bad guys, is that we feel as strongly about doing our job as they do about theirs.
Yep.
So
and doing it in an ethical, professional manner. Always taking the high road of any given situation.
Sure, I'd like to think so.
Yeah.
Cool. I think that's all we have, man.
Yeah, that's it for today.
Sweet. All right, folks. So that's all we have for you. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends. And you can like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We're on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, and also on Twitter. And we have a blog at offsec.blog. So hope to see you there. Have a good weekend.